as you mentioned, we are pleased to be joined here in studio by the voice of SU men's lacrosse, in addition to other things, our good friend Tim Leonard. And, Tim, it all gets started Sunday night inside the Dome. I guess we'll start with Selection Sunday. Were you surprised Hopkins got the 3 and Cuse got the 4, and does it matter?
I was a little surprised. I think Syracuse should have gotten the 3, but I think this is a pretty common take. It is actually maybe a more favorable draw to have the 4 seed. And in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it matters too much. The biggest thing with the 4 seed is you're now looking at likely Notre Dame in the first game of championship weekend, which would be a good problem to have if Syracuse gets back to Memorial Day weekend for the first time since 2013, and they're playing Notre Dame for the second time this year. I do think that they probably, they had the head-to-head over Hopkins. They probably should have been the 3. But in general, I think the biggest thing with that was they wanted to avoid ACC teams going against each other in the quarterfinal matchups. And now there's actually a chance that all 4 ACC teams could be there in championship weekend, which would be pretty amazing. And just a rerun of the ACC tournament from Charlotte, pretty much.
Yeah, we had Chris Yastrzemski on earlier in the week, and that is his bracket. He's got all 4. Yes, he's got all 4 going to the Final Four. And he's got Notre Dame, Virginia in the final, Notre Dame winning the whole thing. Wow. Is this team ahead of schedule, this Cuse team? We had Gary Gate on Bridge Street today. It's year 3 under him, and I brought that up, and he said, really, this is kind of like year 2, because there was the transition year, and now this is really the second year of what he's wanted to accomplish. Do you think they're ahead of schedule?
I do. I think a lot of people ask me going into the season, what would be a good goal for this team? And I always answered, and I think this was pretty consistent for anyone that was following the team, if they could win a game in the tournament this year and get to the quarterfinals and then get your first NCAA tournament win since 2017 as a program, that would be a successful season. And now here we are, and it almost feels like, if they win against Towson, which they should win in a way because they are 3.5 goal favorites, then they will likely be favorites against either 5 seed Denver or unseeded Michigan, who is playing very good and just won the Big Ten title. But it almost feels like now it would be a little bit of a disappointment if they didn't get back to championship weekend, considering they should be favored to get there. So that, to me, means that they are ahead of schedule to be talking about, all right, if you don't make championship weekend, it's a disappointment. The thing that you have to consider here, and I think we kind of took it for granted even going into the ACC tournament, none of those guys really have played any postseason lacrosse, with the exception of Jake Stevens and Sam English. And Stevens had 4 goals in the ACC tournament and had one of his better games. So even a guy like Will Mark, he's been around forever, and I think everyone expects him to bounce back and play a strong game after a very uncharacteristic game for him in the ACC tournament. But they're new to postseason lacrosse. They got a taste of it against Duke, and it's a different animal. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind is if Syracuse were to make it to championship weekend, even if they lose to, say, Notre Dame in that first game in the Final Four, that is a remarkable season when you consider that then you're looking at probably a preseason number 1 or 2 team going into next year, considering all the pieces that are coming back. And then you'd have guys like Joey Spallina, Finn Thompson would get a taste of championship weekend going into their upperclassmen years.
Mason Cohn was quick to point out earlier this week that he's played in a Final Four, obviously Division III. But you're right. The experience this time of year is just not there for this team, with the exception of a number of guys that you can count on one hand. How much does that matter? The fact that they haven't been in the NCAA tournament, and do you expect that to be an issue for this team at all? Should they make it to the Final Four?
I think it matters in the sense that if it's a close game and it starts to come down to a face-off here or an individual play here, then that's when you really probably start to rely on guys like Sam English. You think about some of these close games Syracuse has won this year. First off, the Cornell game comes to mind because English hit the game-tying goal before overtime. They didn't win that game, but English was doing some big things, and even Jake Stevens was the guy who grabbed the face-off on the wing and passed it to Sam English on that play to force overtime. Then you think about the Virginia game, and it was English and Thompson that was running the 2-man game, and English shooting and scoring a lot in the fourth quarter there. The Hopkins game, I believe it was just Sam English and Jake Stevens that scored in the fourth quarter. So they can lean on those guys once you get into crunch time. And I think that's valuable, and that's something they didn't have on last year's team. And, Mason Cohen has been involved in some huge face-offs in his career. So that's nice to know when you're going to have a big face-off or two over the course of the NCAA playoffs, whether it's in the first game, second game, whatever. But in general, I think this team is, if anything, on the young side, or it's underrated how young they are. But overall, they'll be fine. I mean, these guys have all played in big games, and Joey Spallina's played in big games from a young age.
We had Gary on Bridge Street today, as I mentioned, and he admitted that, the guys are probably a little nervous. The fact that it's an NCAA tournament game. And, again, he brought up the fact that they don't have a lot of experience, this time of year as well. What do you think this game comes down to on Sunday? It's a Towson team that, again, they haven't played the same schedule as Syracuse, but they're on a roll, right? I mean, they've won 9 in a row. They must be feeling pretty good about themselves. What stands out to you about this team as you prepare to call the game?
Yeah, and the other thing is Towson doesn't have nearly as much pressure on them as Syracuse. I mean, that is a thing to consider. Of course, Syracuse is nervous. They understand the recent history in the tournament, and they understand that the Syracuse fan base is bigger than any fan base in the sport. What stands out about Towson is they do have statistically a very strong team just because of partially the schedule they have played. They haven't played, outside of playing Delaware, a ranked team that Syracuse did play, and they looked very good against Delaware in the CAA conference tournament. Outside of playing them, they haven't played a lot of ranked teams since the start of the year. They lost to Virginia by 4 goals, which, if anything, was misleading because they were down by quite a bit throughout most of that game. They lost to Hopkins in their first game of the season, 13-5. So there's not a ton to go off of in terms of top 10 opponents outside of that, and it's been a while, and I'm sure they're a different team. But I think what it comes down to, the faceoffs is going to be key once again. And Syracuse lost to Duke in the ACC tournament because they didn't figure out Cal Gerard, the reserve faceoff guy who filled in for Jake Naso, until the second quarter. They ended up winning the faceoffs in that game, but they lost the first 6 faceoffs, and they didn't touch the ball, and it was 5-0. And all of a sudden, there's 9 minutes left in the first quarter, and they didn't even know what hit them. So I think that's going to be valuable, what the faceoff discrepancy is in the end of this game, because Mason Cohen has been great all season. They've really improved there, but now it gets into, all right, it's just one game. If the faceoff unit has an off game here, Syracuse could be looking uphill at a loss come the fourth quarter.
We saw a huge crowd with the Virginia game, and that was, Paul Gate jersey retirement, and obviously it was Virginia, and there was a alumni weekend and so on and so forth. Are you starting to see the crowds continue to grow? Like, are you starting to get the vibe? And I know you're a young guy, but are you starting to get the vibe of this is moving in the direction of Syracuse from back in the day?
No doubt. I think that was a big project of Gary this year. He was really putting a lot of emphasis on making sure the crowds get to be an advantage. And I think they were up about 1,000 per game in attendance this year, which is pretty solid. And some of that's just they were a winning team, and they hosted a lot of big games and won some big games inside the Dome. So, yeah, I would expect another big crowd this weekend, and it should be, because this is, the last chance to go see the team play, and it's the biggest game of the year. And when you talk about, all right, is this year going to be a success or not, and how do you evaluate the first 3 years under Gary Gate, you hate to put it all on one game because you don't want to put too much pressure on one game. But to me, if they win this game, then you're looking into next year with a lot of positive momentum, regardless of what happens the rest of the playoffs. If they lose this game, it's hard to say the season was a success because you're just going to remember, they were good. And then, the big but is, they didn't win in the postseason. They lost to Duke, and then they skidded down the stretch. So not saying that's going to happen, and it maybe shouldn't all be on one game, the evaluation of 3 years, but that's what happens in lacrosse. Like, it's win or go home, and any bit of fan support this weekend, I think, would go a long way.
I don't think you're speaking out of turn there. I mean, we've got Pat March on next. I would assume the coaches, the players would all say that if they lose this game, it's going to feel like a disappointing season.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that's, I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility, or out of the question rather, that they would feel that way. Let's get one basketball question for you before you go. The women had been very quiet in the portal until recently.
Yeah.
They've got a couple of additions. What can you tell us about those additions?
Yeah, a good point guard from LSU, Angelica Veliz, is coming over, 5'7" point guard who was a very highly rated recruit, number 44 recruit, which is a coincidence maybe for Syracuse in a way. Number 44 ranked recruit in her class. Went to LSU, who, of course, is with Angel Reese, been in the national championship picture the last couple years. Lost in the Elite Eight this year. Didn't play a ton, but opted to transfer. Syracuse was on her radar out of high school. Grew up in the Bronx, and seems like a great fit because they were kind of lacking a point guard. Not that she's going to replace Deasia Fair scoring, but they were lacking a starting point guard option. Now you feel comfortable with her as the starter probably, and Dominique Camp as a good reserve option, assuming she returns and is healthy for next season. And then Journey Thompson is a 6'3" forward. They got a commitment from her, Arizona State, who averaged about 5.5 points per game last year. So that gives them some length. So when I talked, I think with Brian maybe a week ago on his show, and we were sort of saying, yeah, they're quiet in the portal. Here's what they need. I would say they needed a point guard and they needed some length, and they've gotten that so far. They still have some scholarships to fill, but the roster started to come together, so I think you can breathe a little bit easier about what they have going into next season now.
All right, certainly good news there, and I know you'll be on the call Sunday night. 7:30 face-off inside the Dome. Pregame starts at 7:15.
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock as we get you set for Syracuse.
Don't
and
try and
Townsend.
steal 15 minutes from Tim Leonard.
Yeah, no. I'll be tuning in at 7 now that I know. All right, Tim, great stuff as always.
You believe that, Tim?
Nah, I don't know. He's a busy guy. Sunday night. Maybe,
Sunday night.
maybe.
It's Sunday night. Yes.
You're going to sit by the radio?
I'm going to listen to Tim and watch the game. Can we do that? Can we do both?
He'll be enjoying his hobby of spending time with his family.
That's right. That's right around bedtime.
He's gaslighting us right now.
All right, we're going to keep the lacrosse conversation going on the other side. Pat March, offensive coordinator, associate head coach, joins us next on ESPN Radio.